The sun was sinking over the Texas plains when the first smell of smoke drifted through the barbed wire. Not the kind they knew, not gunpowder, not diesel, but mesquite wood and sizzling meat. From inside the camp, hundreds of German prisoners turned their heads toward the scent. Somewhere beyond the fence, a radio crackled with country music, and a man's voice called out in English, slow and warm. "Y'all hungry over there?" They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Within an hour, the guards opened the gate. The prisoners hesitated, trained to expect deception, humiliation. But what waited wasn't punishment. It was a long wooden table under the open sky, covered in dishes they had only seen in propaganda reels meant to mock American excess. White bread, potato salad, cold Coca-Cola bottles sweating in the heat. When a cowboy in a broad hat waved them over, some refused to move. Others stepped forward, unsure, boots sinking into the red dirt. One prisoner, a former Wehrmacht sergeant, accepted a plate of smoked beef. He chewed once, twice, then stopped. His jaw trembled. "This can't be real," he whispered. Around him, men who had fought across Europe, men who had watched cities burn, stood frozen before a kindness that felt like defeat. That night, as the stars came out, the camp was silent, not from fear, but confusion. The war they thought they understood, the enemy they thought they knew, had just dissolved over a simple barbecue. They didn't know it yet, but this was only the first crack in everything they believed. They boarded the train at night, not knowing where they were going, only that it was far from the ruins of Europe. Inside the wooden cars, the air was thick with silence and cigarette smoke. No guards barked orders, no dogs, just a quiet hum of wheels against rails and a strange absence of fear. Then, somewhere in Arkansas, a boy on a bicycle pedaled alongside the train. He waved. Some of the men, still wearing the gray of the Wehrmacht, looked away in embarrassment. One man, Hans, a mechanic from Leipzig, lifted his hand and waved back. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Habit. Or something deeper. When the train crossed into Texas, it was like entering another world. Neon signs flickered in the night. Drive-in theaters. Gas stations still open at midnight. A prisoner murmured, "It looks like a city during a festival." But the American guard beside him replied, "This is just Tuesday night. Pal." They passed rows of farms with tractors larger than any they had seen, silos like cathedrals, and always the lights. They realized something quietly devastating. This country had never gone dark. What they didn't know yet was how deep that brightness would cut. The projector whirred to life in the camp recreation hall, casting flickering light onto the wall. Dozens of German POWs sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, curious, guarded. A film was about to begin. Not propaganda, not newsreel, but something called Victory Through Air Power. They didn't understand every word, but they understood enough. One scene showed a Liberty ship being built, massive cranes lifting hulls, hundreds of men swarming over steel like ants. Then came the time lapse. From keel to launch in 4 days. 4 days. A young engineer from Munich, blonde, proud, skeptical, scoffed at the screen. "Lies," he muttered. "Impossible." But then another scene played. A second ship, then a third. Each stamped out like bakery bread. He said nothing after that. After the film ended, no one moved for a while. One man quietly asked the American staff sergeant, "How many?" The guard replied, "About 2,700 last year, give or take." The room felt smaller after that. Somewhere in the stillness, a belief collapsed. Not with a bang, but like a silent beam snapping in an old cathedral. But that was just the beginning. It was supposed to be lights out. That's what they were told, same as in every camp. But that night, as Hans lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, something strange seeped through the wooden slats of the barracks. Light, not from lanterns or torches. Not the flicker of campfires. It was steady, humming, artificial, electric. He stepped outside and the whole compound was aglow. Bulbs strung between poles, illuminating pathways, watchtowers, even the baseball field. The Texas night was lit up like Christmas in peacetime Berlin. He wasn't the only one drawn by it. Dozens of prisoners stood in silence, bathed in yellow-white glow, their shadows stretching behind them. No one spoke. They didn't have to. In Germany, electricity was rationed. Cities went dark at dusk. Even hospitals dimmed their corridors. But here, in a prison, it was wasted on nothing at all. One man muttered, "They're showing off." Another replied, "No, they just don't think twice." That quiet difference struck deeper than any bullet, not just the power itself, but the casualness of it. As if light was a birthright, not a luxury. And in that moment, many of them realized they weren't prisoners of war. They were witnesses to a civilization they were never meant to see. The guard leaned casually against the mess hall doorway, arms crossed, watching the German POWs file in with empty trays. "Lunch today's the same as ours," he said with a grin, as if it were a joke. But it wasn't. Inside, the prisoners stared in disbelief. White bread. Lettuce so crisp it cracked when you bit it. A hamburger the size of a clenched fist, still steaming. And the Holy Grail. Coca-Cola in glass bottles, glistening with condensation. Back in Europe, Coca-Cola had become myth, a symbol of American indulgence, mocked in Nazi cartoons. To see it now, here chilled, uncapped, offered freely, was surreal. A young soldier named Otto held the bottle like it might vanish. He sniffed it first, tasted, sweet, acidic, alive. He swallowed, then glanced around to see if anyone was watching. One of the American cooks winked. The real shock wasn't the food. It was the gesture. This wasn't nourishment. It was hospitality. A small, absurd mercy that undercut every speech they'd ever heard about American savagery. Someone whispered, "This is how they treat prisoners?" Another replied, "Imagine how they treat their friends." But that was nothing compared to what they saw next. They were somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic when it happened. A steel-gray transport ship rocking gently under an overcast sky. The German POWs stood near the railing, seasick, silent, watching the horizon. Then from below deck came a noise no one expected, the cheerful clink of spoons against metal bowls. And laughter. American laughter. They followed the sound, confused, until the cargo hatch opened and two sailors emerged, carrying tubs of ice cream. Real ice cream, in flavors. One sailor dipped a spoon into vanilla, took a slow, exaggerated bite, then looked up at the stunned prisoners and said, "You boys want some?" Hans blinked, speechless. Dieter shook his head. "It's a trick," he muttered. But others began to murmur, step forward, stare. They thought it was rations for officers. But no, this was for the crew. Ordinary sailors, eating frozen dessert, on a warship. Back in Europe, even generals hadn't tasted ice cream in years. Yet here it was, melting under the sea breeze, not hoarded, not rationed, just normal. That night, one of the German officers didn't speak during dinner. When asked why, he finally said, "You don't win wars with ice cream, but maybe you win men." Something even stranger came next. The train rolled into the siding with a low groan, its wheels hissing against the Texas heat. The German POWs stepped off slowly, expecting the usual: dusty roads, barking orders, maybe another barbed wire camp. Instead, they were met with velvet curtains, brass handles, and porters in crisp uniforms. It was a Pullman car. For a moment, no one moved. This wasn't a military transport. This was the kind of carriage they'd only seen in American movies. The ones Goebbels had banned. Plush seats, ceiling fans, table lamps with little green shades, and above all, silence. No shouting, no rushing, just a quiet dignity that felt more unsettling than any interrogation. A young POW with soot-streaked cheeks leaned in and whispered, "This must be a mistake." But it wasn't. Lunch was served. Real silverware, linen napkins, roast beef sliced to order. The American escort, a Texan with boots polished like mirrors, nodded toward an empty seat and said, "Make yourself comfortable. We've got a ways to go." One German officer refused to sit. He stood for the entire ride, arms crossed, staring out the window, not in defiance, but in disbelief. Later, that same man wrote in his journal, "They gave us dignity we had not earned, and it felt like defeat." They thought it couldn't go deeper than that. It could. The pain started in his lower back, sharp, sudden, and unforgiving. Kurt, a 41-year-old former artilleryman from Hamburg, tried to hide it for 2 days. He'd survived the Russian front. He wasn't about to complain to the Americans. But by the third morning, he couldn't stand straight. A guard noticed. Instead of a scolding, there was a call on the radio. Within the hour, a military ambulance arrived. The other prisoners watched as Kurt was helped inside. Not dragged, not shouted at, just helped. 2 hours later, he returned with something cradled in his hands like treasure, an X-ray. His own spine captured in perfect ghostly detail on glossy paper. "They took me to a hospital," he told the others. "Not a prison infirmary. A real hospital. The doctor said my vertebrae are compressed. They gave me pills and a mattress." The silence that followed was heavier than shock. In Germany, wounded soldiers were patched up if they were useful. Prisoners, especially foreign ones, weren't worth morphine. But here, the enemy's medical technology was offered freely. No bribes, no bargains, just care. That night, Kurt lay on his new mattress staring at the ceiling, not from pain, but because he couldn't sleep. His body was healing, but his certainty in everything he'd been taught had begun to break, and the next blow would come not from science, but from something far more dangerous: compassion. The camp's small library was barely more than a shed, but it had books, real ones, English novels, history texts, even a copy of Popular Mechanics. Most POWs ignored it at first, assuming it was just another American trap, re-education wrapped in paper. Until one morning, a soft-spoken guard, Johnson, the one from Abilene who always hummed old blues tunes, walked in holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently on the desk and said, "Thought your boys might like this." Inside were German books, Goethe, Heine, a dog-eared copy of All Quiet on the Western Front, and in the back, handwritten pamphlets, German translations of American poems, clipped and stapled by someone's grandmother. A group of POWs gathered around, hesitant. One man picked up the Heine, flipped to a random page, and began to read aloud. His voice cracked, not from shame, from memory. Within a week, the library became a meeting place. Not for propaganda, for poetry. Some prisoners started asking for English dictionaries. A few requested Hemingway. One asked for Twain. They didn't know what they were looking for. They only knew something was shifting. And then came the shock that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with power. The sky was overcast the day the cargo convoy rolled through, its gray hulls lining the port like sleeping beasts. German POWs, assigned to routine labor, were stationed nearby, hauling, loading, waiting. That's when they saw it. A massive antenna mounted atop a supply ship, not a battleship, not a destroyer, a supply ship. It turned slowly, humming with quiet menace. At first, they didn't believe what they were seeing. "It can't be radar," one muttered. "It's just decoration." Another replied, "No, it's tracking." One of the prisoners, Once a radio technician back in Dresden stepped closer. His face went pale. "That's a parabolic dish. We don't even have those on our U-boats." The implications landed like a punch. Radar on cargo ships meant every convoy could see incoming attacks before they arrived. It meant blind torpedoes. It meant silence in the dark no longer meant safety. They had fought battles thinking they had surprise. They hadn't. That night, back in the barracks, one prisoner folded his hands and whispered, "We lost this war long before we knew it." But the most humbling lesson wasn't what the Americans built. It was what they were willing to leave behind. They were moving supplies from one depot to another when they found it. A fenced-off storage yard outside the base, half covered in canvas. A gust of wind peeled the tarp back, revealing rows of rusting drums. The stencils read, "Avgas 100 LLO aviation fuel." There were hundreds of them, thousands of gallons. An officer asked the American foreman, half joking, "Should we help you move it to the airfield?" The foreman laughed. "Nah, we're not using this anymore. Probably gonna burn it." Burn it. The Germans stood motionless. In the Reich, they had watched men die over 10 liters of fuel. Entire divisions had been stranded because a convoy was late. But here, in a dusty lot in Texas, the Americans were preparing to destroy enough aviation fuel to power an entire Luftwaffe squadron. And they did. That night, flames lit up the sky. Black smoke curled above the planes as the Americans burned it all. Not out of spite, not out of panic, but because it was more trouble than it was worth. One prisoner whispered, "They're not just rich, they're careless. And somehow, they can afford to be." But the fire hadn't reached their deepest fear yet. That was still coming. The warehouse looked like any other. Wide steel doors, forklifts humming in and out, crates stacked high to the rafters. But what made the German prisoners stop in their tracks wasn't the size. It was what they found behind a row of half-empty pallets, crates of artillery shells with clear markings, VT in bold black stencil. One of them, a former artillery lieutenant, froze. "Variable time," he said under his breath. His American escort, a young corporal with a lazy drawl, nodded. Proximity fuses. Those little suckers don't wait to hit you. They explode when they sense you're there. The lieutenant staggered back. He had seen entire squadrons torn apart midair. Flak bursts that seemed impossibly accurate. He had blamed spies, sabotage, luck. Now he saw it was science. Back home, Germany's brightest minds were building rockets and jet engines. But here, in some anonymous depot in the American South, this terrifying technology was stockpiled casually, like canned beans. He didn't speak again for the rest of the shift. That night, someone whispered in the barracks, "They weren't aiming better. They knew where we were." The next morning, nobody joked about the war anymore. It was a bitter memory buried under snow. Until someone brought up Bastogne. The younger POWs shifted uncomfortably, but one man, Carl, a seasoned infantry officer, spoke up. His voice was flat, hollow. "They came out of the fog like ghosts," he said. "We thought they were lost. Stragglers. Then our radios went dead. Our mortars missed every shot. And our line folded." He described the artillery falling with unnatural precision. The way the American shells didn't land on them. They burst above them. Trees shattered. Helmets rang like bells. And worst of all, the silence that followed. There was no shouting, no chaos, just disappearance. Another POW interrupted, "But you said we held them back." Carl looked at him, then down at his hands. "We didn't. We just survived long enough for them to stop." In that moment, the mythology they had clung to, of German superiority, of discipline and resolve, cracked wide open. Bastogne wasn't just a defeat. It was the day they realized they'd been fighting an enemy that had already outgrown them. One man, usually defiant, whispered, "If that's what they brought to the Ardennes, what haven't we seen yet?" They thought they had reached the limit. They hadn't. The story came from a pilot, young, blonde, and quiet since capture. He rarely spoke, but one evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows through the fence, he broke his silence. "They shot us down," he said, "before we even saw them." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. "We took off at dawn. Visibility was poor. No enemy sightings, but halfway across the channel, the air lit up." He described it not as a dogfight, but a slaughter. American fighters emerged from the clouds, already in position, already turning to intercept. "They knew we were coming," he said. "Not guessed. Knew." Someone asked if it was just radar. He shook his head. It felt unfair. For men raised on stories of chivalric air duels, this was heresy. There was no room left for honor, no time for maneuvering. Only speed, precision, and a machine that could see through the fog. Another POW muttered, "So this is what happens when science replaces war with mathematics." They were no longer fighting an enemy. They were fighting inevitability. But the cruelest blow wasn't what the Americans used. It was what they wasted. The sun was punishing that day, not with heat, but with indifference. It shimmered off rows of metal drums like mirrors. The German POWs squinted, their shirts clinging with sweat as they moved crates near the edge of a supply yard. That's when they saw it. Barrels marked avgas, 100 octane, left exposed in the open air. They froze. One of them, Franz, who had served in the Africa Corps, stepped closer. He counted the drums, then again. At least 50,000 gallons, maybe more. Enough to keep an entire Luftwaffe squadron in the sky for weeks. He whispered, "This is fuel for gods." An American truck pulled up. 2 GIs jumped out with torches and accelerant. No ceremony, no salvage, no accounting. Burn it. Burn it all. The Germans watched in horror as flame devoured what they had once killed for. In the desert, they had bled for a few rusted jerry cans. Here in Texas, fuel was disposable, abundant, forgotten. The fire hissed and cracked like mockery. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Later that night, someone whispered, "It's not that they have more. It's that they don't even need it." But the ember that burned deepest wasn't rage. It was something far more corrosive. Awe. The news came not with a trumpet, but a shrug. A supply officer strolled past the camp gate, chatting idly with a Texan sergeant. "Washington wants us to scrap the trucks," he said. "No use hauling them back." The sergeant laughed. "Guess we'll leave 'em here. Let the sun eat 'em." A few POWs overheard. They didn't react. Not right away. But word spread, and by sundown, a small crowd gathered near the fence line, staring through the mesh at a line of brand new military vehicles. Engines untouched, tires still thick with tread, parked in the dust, keys still in the ignitions, left behind. No sabotage, no scuttling, no effort to strip them down. Just abandonment. A former tank mechanic named Emil muttered, "That truck would be an officer's prize back home. They just walk away?" Another quieter voice replied, "They don't even turn off the lights." What shattered them wasn't just the excess, it was the disinterest, as if victory had made these machines obsolete before their time. That night, a POW sketched one of the trucks in his notebook, not as a vehicle, but as a symbol, a monument to a war machine so vast it could afford to forget its own strength. They didn't know it yet, but their real battle, the one inside, was just beginning. The smell hit first. Sharp, rich, unmistakable, burnt fat and sweet molasses, smoke drifting on the Texas wind. It wasn't coming from the mess hall. It came from the field beyond the outer fence, where a group of locals had set up a makeshift pit barbecue. Cowboys, veterans, churchgoers. They stood around with boots planted in the dust, tending brisket and ribs like sacred offerings. Then came the sound. Guitars. Laughter. Someone popped open a Coca-Cola bottle. And then, impossibly, a voice shouted toward the camp, "Tell those boys to come eat. We made extra." For a moment, no one moved. The guards looked around. The prisoners looked at the guards. And then the gates opened. They walked out slowly, unsure if it was real. No barking, no orders, just the hum of music and the clatter of paper plates. A cowboy handed a rib to a former German officer, a man who had once ordered the burning of entire villages. The officer hesitated, then took it. He bit into it, and something inside him broke. Not because of the taste, not even because of the kindness, but because this absurd, informal, unnecessary gesture was what finally made him understand. They hadn't just lost the war. They had lost the world they believed in. The letter was never meant to be read aloud. But one evening, as the wind pushed dry leaves across the barracks floor, a young POW named Lucas unfolded it anyway. His hands trembled. His voice was barely louder than a whisper. "Liebe Martha," he began. It had been months since he wrote her. His wife, still in Munich, still waiting. He told her about the camp, about the food, about the Americans who offered more comfort in a prison than their own officers had in uniform. He wrote about the library, about the Coca-Cola, about a farmer's wife who brought him a peach pie and said, "You look like you miss home." He paused then, looking around. No one interrupted. Then came the part that silenced even the creaking roof beams. "I don't know if I believe in anything we fought for anymore. I feel I've been lied to, not just by men, but by my country's soul." His voice broke. Another prisoner reached out, gently took the page from his hand, and folded it shut. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just sat there, listening to the quiet, as if something sacred had just been buried between the floorboards. Outside, the American flag flapped in the night breeze, steady, unbothered, utterly foreign. It started with silence, not the awkward kind, the heavy, deliberate kind, the kind that settles into a room and refuses to leave. For weeks, the German prisoners had debated, argued, fought in whispers over ideology, over Hitler, over what the war meant. Each man clung to some sliver of certainty. Duty, pride, nationalism. The world might be upside down, but the cause, the Reich, had once made sense. Until it didn't. One afternoon, a discussion in the barracks turned to Dresden. A younger POW, eyes full of ash and memory, said quietly, "We started the fire. We just didn't think it would reach home." No one responded. No shouts, no outrage. Just lowered gazes. A man who once boasted about serving in the SS removed the insignia he'd sewn into his inner pocket. Another folded his arms across a faded eagle tattoo. A third quietly began teaching himself English, tracing the words in Tom Sawyer with a fingertip like prayer. No orders were given. No conversions were preached. The change didn't come from outside. It came from erosion, each gesture small, but together, unmistakable. And when they finally stopped arguing, it wasn't because they agreed. It was because they couldn't defend it anymore. It was just a question, soft, almost casual, spoken by a POW with tired eyes and a stitched-up hand. He stood at the library counter, thumbing the edge of an old dictionary. "Do you have Mark Twain?" The American clerk, a corporal from Alabama with ink stains on his sleeves, looked up. He didn't laugh. He didn't question. He just nodded and disappeared into the back. Moments later, he returned with The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, its cover worn, its spine taped twice over. The German took it as if receiving something sacred. He carried it to the corner, opened to the first page, and stared. He couldn't read most of it. Not yet. But he lingered over the illustrations. The raft, the picket fence, the river that never ended. Later that week, more men asked for books, not manuals, not translated Mein Kampf copies smuggled from home. Real stories. American stories. They weren't surrendering, not in the military sense, but something inside them, a wall, was beginning to soften. One man said, "I don't want to escape anymore." Another added, "I just want to understand how a country like this came to be." They had come as soldiers. Now they were becoming witnesses, but one final image would haunt them forever. It was near dusk when the train came. The prisoners lined up quietly, bags in hand, orders in pocket. Repatriation. The war was over. They were going home, whatever home meant now. No guards rushed them, no dogs, just the sound of boots on gravel and a warm breeze slipping through the cotton fields. As the cars filled, one man, Friedrich, once a proud officer in the Panzer Corps, lingered at the edge of the platform. He looked back at the camp, not the fence, not the guard towers, but the porch swing creaking on the barracks front stoop, the tree where someone had carved a heart, the basketball hoop the GIs had let them use. He stepped onto the train and sat by the window. As it pulled away, he stared into the sun-drenched horizon, eyes tracing the power lines that ran for miles, uninterrupted, humming with silent purpose. Beside him, a younger POW unfolded a scrap of paper, a sketch. It showed a long wooden table, a fire pit, and figures gathered around with hats tipped back, laughing, eating. One of them wore a German uniform, the others cowboy boots. At the bottom the boy had written in English, "They fed us, and they ruined us." Friedrich closed his eyes. He had come to this land wearing iron on his chest and fury in his bones. He left with neither, just questions, and a memory that would never fully make sense. They came as soldiers. They left as witnesses. But there was still one place they were never shown, one truth they were never meant to see. I'll show you that next time. If this changed how you see history, share it with someone who still remembers. And if your grandfather once spoke of Texas and the stars above the camp, you might know exactly what he meant.